Let's talk now to Shimeon Lee, who is a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Alliance. It is really good to see you, Shimeon. I have my doubts over government contracts, as you could hear.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right that there are huge issues with government procurement. I think this new report really points it out. I think what was in the report was really numbers that we've seen before, but I don't think that makes them any less shocking. I mean, 100,000 asylum seekers costing taxpayers £15 billion in accommodation alone. So that's 3 times more than was originally estimated. I think the use of hotels in particular is particularly outrageous when there are people in this country that are struggling to get by. But, you know, I think whether it's hotels or flats or HMOs, the fundamental problem is really taxpayers having to house these 100,000 people in the first place. Now, absolutely, there are issues with the management of contracts that you talked about, the sort of financial incentives, the penalties, the lack of clawing back some of the profits. But if we don't address the root cause of this issue, which is the legal architecture around the asylum system and other pull factors, you know, at the end of the day, even if we solve all these procurement issues, the only thing we'll accomplish is, you know, finding more efficient ways to waste taxpayers' money. I think the Home Office, for all of its failures, have had their hands really tied by the law. They can't detain asylum seekers while their claims are being processed. They can't remove these asylum seekers when their claims are rejected. But at the same time, they have to feed and house them for as long as the process takes. And what that means, essentially, is that when someone claims asylum, they have the right to stay for as long as the process takes at the taxpayer's expense. So, of course, you'll have more asylum claims, which mean even longer processing time, which means even more asylum claims. It's a vicious cycle.
And you have a situation, though, with these contracts. Just go back to those at the moment, because I was reading about them this afternoon. And it's not, this is the other thing, it's not built into the contracts. It's not in the interests of Serco or any of the other companies that without challenge won these bids, right, to move these men and women into cheaper accommodation. There is no penalty. So they keep them in the more expensive accommodation in order to increase their profits, and then they fudge the profits, and some of it is in cash, so that they don't have to pay that back. This is a fundamental fault. I understand exactly what you're saying, and of course the legal framework around the asylum claims has to be put in place, but if we just look at the contracts, this is about money. Always follow the money. People are ripping this country off, and it's not the migrants ripping the country off. It's British companies ripping the taxpayer off.
I think you're absolutely right that there's been a huge failure in terms of setting up of some of these contracts. And of course, as you mentioned, a hotel, housing a migrant, housing an asylum seeker rather, in a hotel is about 6 times more expensive than housing them elsewhere. So of course, these companies have an incentive to keep these people in these places for as long as possible and not move them into other forms of accommodation. But of course, there's also a broader issue that is the housing shortage in this country that has driven up the cost of housing, that makes it very difficult to sort of source accommodation for these people, because hotels are actually supposed to be a form of emergency accommodation.
Yeah.
And the reason why we've had to rely so much on these hotels and so much on these private providers is because of the housing shortage that makes it very expensive for the Home Office to place people in other forms of accommodation. And I think that's one of the broader, deeper issues that we have to deal with if we want to get control of the situation. And until we deal with that, which is going to be a very, very difficult thing, you know, fixing things like the planning system, which causes the housing shortage in the first place, is going to be very difficult to move away from these hotel costs for asylum seekers.
But it also feels like once asylum seekers, if they are moved from this incredibly expensive accommodation, and not by any means luxury for them, it is expensive because what we're being charged for it could be a lot cheaper, and it's expensive because they're being held there for longer. You know, what do? We have, you know, hundreds of thousands perhaps of HMOs where people are just dumped and then told just get on with it, right? That, you know, community, just get on with it. That is another problem, isn't it?
I think one of the issues that this report highlights is that it's quite a lose-lose situation for everyone involved, basically. It's not a good deal for the taxpayers, but even for these asylum seekers who are living in these places, they're dealing with, in many cases, very, very poor sort of accommodation in terms of things like mold and some of the issues with these accommodation. These are not, you know, the best quality accommodation. I think it's a lose-lose because taxpayers lose because we're paying more for these things, and the asylum seekers themselves don't really want to be there. So I think we have to take action to solve this.
What would you want to see immediately done with these contracts that run for at least another 5 years? I mean, it's absolutely disgusting that they're not even trying to reclaim these capped profits, and as far as I'm concerned, there shouldn't be profit in this system. This should be a not-for-profit system, so that it is fair to the taxpayer. Why are we paying not only the costs, but also the phenomenal amount of profit that is being gained? What kind of deal was that?
So I think there's a break clause in 2026 where the government can sort of end some of these contracts without any penalties, and that will really strengthen their negotiating position when it comes to renegotiating some of these contracts. But I think there's some really basic things that the government can do in order to recover some of these costs. You mentioned profit sharing. As part of these contracts, the government is allowed to recover a certain percentage of profits. And the fact of the matter is that they haven't actually done that. So we've had tens of millions of pounds sitting in the bank accounts of these providers that they want to hand over to the government, but the government haven't actually asked for it or haven't actually reached out to get money back. I think that's something really, really basic that we expect the government to be able to do. More broadly speaking, we have to sort of renegotiate some of these contracts. And once again, as I said, solve the broader sort of policy and sort of legal problems that cause thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to come in and sort of clog up the system, meaning that we have to house them.
But, okay, looking at that, again, everybody blames the migrant, okay, or sorry, the asylum seeker or the refugee seeker, right? They're all being hated and blamed for the amount of money that's being spent on them. They're being hated and blamed for where they end up. They're being hated and blamed for everything. But the way I see it is that the systems encourage more people to come across. The Tories did it. Labour's doing it. You know, there's no danger once you get onto British shores. You're pretty much assured that you can stay here. So, you know, haven't we got to turn that on its head and stop blaming the people who are taking advantage of the system and blaming it on those who have failed the system?
I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's not about whether, you know, the people coming over are good people or bad people. At the end of the day, it's a matter of incentives, right? Yeah. If we create the wrong sort of incentives, people are going to come here. And if we create the right incentives, then they won't. I mean, the previous government tried to take some action on this in terms of things like the Rwanda scheme, where they would be moved to a safe third country for processing. I think that would have massively changed the incentives of people who want to come here. But of course, that faced massive sort of legal challenges as well. I think that's one of the other issues that is one of the huge issues that cause a lot of these problems, is because there's a lot of gaming of the system in terms of not necessarily the asylum seekers themselves, but things like lawyers, you know, submitting last-minute appeals that really drag out the process. And of course, because the Home Office has an obligation to feed and house these people while these appeals are ongoing, even if they are, you know, frankly, frivolous appeals, that's going to drag out the cost even more.
And again, that is something that the taxpayer is funding, where people can't get legal aid for anything in this country. It appears that if you've come here and you're claiming asylum to which you're not entitled, you get free legal aid. Again, it's the system that is encouraging this behaviour. So the system has got to change, and then we won't see the amount of people coming across.
I think you're right that the system has to change, but I'm quite concerned about the government's, you know, attempts to solve this problem. I mean, what they've said is that they want to reduce the number of people in the system. Now, that can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean, you know, reducing demand by deterring people from coming, which should be the way that we solve this. Or it can simply mean, you know, waving everyone in. So if you think about it, the path of least resistance for the government is actually to simply just approve a lot of these claims, because once you approve these claims, the government no longer has an obligation to house them. They can start working. They can do all these things. And if, of course, once you approve these claims, you don't have to go through the very difficult legal challenges of actually removing someone. You know, about 50% of enforced removals were actually cancelled because of things like last-minute legal challenges. But, you know, when you approve all these claims, that just leads to the exact opposite outcome that you want, because people will then have an even greater incentive to come, because they know that, you know, it's very likely that their claims will be approved. You know, between 2019 and 2022, actually, the approval rate for asylum claims was actually 70%, and that's like a huge number. And that's gone down since then. But because the number of cases have grown so much, in absolute terms, it's actually higher now, the number of people who are actually approved.
Yeah, I mean, and that you can see that that's what Labour is doing. They're just waving more people through so that they can reduce that accommodation bill. And we're not fools, right? We can see this happening. And also when they talk about sending people home in greater numbers, what they're doing is they're picking the low-hanging fruit. They're picking people who have got, you know, back to Algeria or to Turkey or to, you know, countries that are completely safe and there's no objection to. So again, we know what they're doing. I just wish they'd tell us the truth maybe once.
Well, in some cases, they're actually paying people to go. So that's another cost on the taxpayers, like £3,000 if you voluntarily leave. And of course, there's no guarantee that once they leave, they actually stay there, because in a couple of months, they can just come right over again. That was what happened with the government's one in, one out deal, sending people to France, and then that person just came right back over again. And I think in the long term, when you approve a lot of these asylum claims, and they may well be merited, but in the long term, we have to understand that this will just shift the cost from the asylum system over to the welfare system, because in many cases, these people will not be making net contributions to the economy.
Yeah, exactly that. Or it shifts the problems to councils, who then have to house them because that is their duty to do so. Shimeon, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for that.